Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. I'm sure many of you have heard of the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. But if you haven't, it basically goes a little something like this. If you give a mouse a cookie, he'll ask for a glass of milk. If you give him a glass of milk, he'll go on to ask for something else. And on it goes until you found you've given away way too much. It's an easy way of summarizing the left's strategies bent at incrementally radicalizing our culture. It's so simple a child could understand it. What a child isn't meant to understand, though, is the left's bizarre and totally contrived gender theory, which starts with silly Z and Zer pronouns and ends with children on life-altering, puberty-blocking drugs that essentially render them as eunuchs. This is why it matters that regular, everyday people stand firm when confronted with this lunacy. A perfect example is Shawnee State University professor Nicholas Merriweather, who refused to bend to the gender bending at his university and would not use preferred pronouns. He was issued a written rebuke and in fear that his career would be affected, Professor Merriweather sued the school for a breach of his constitutional rights. Shawnee State University, which is located in Ohio, has now settled the suit. And in a victory for Sanity, Professor Merriweather is walking away with a cool $400,000 for his trouble. So what does this mean in the ongoing fight for basic common sense and decency? Joining us now to discuss is the president of the New York Young Republican Club, Gavin. Thanks for being here tonight, Gavin.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Great. So it often feels like all is lost, especially when it comes to the courts. But does this case show that the fight isn't over?
Absolutely. This was a very surprising victory in the courts. We tend not to see a lot of victory in the judicial system nowadays, but we'll take any W that we can find. And this certainly sets some precedent, and it definitely sends a message to many other institutions that if they are going to force people to accept the contrived reality of individuals who are suffering from some form of psychosis, that they cannot push that type of thing onto professors or to anyone. So I'm glad to see that this professor won in the courts. I think it's a step in the right direction, but we need to continue to remain vigilant because, as you said earlier, the left is all about these incremental fights, and they are trying to destroy the basic foundations of civilized society. And at the root of that is the concept of gender, which they are attacking most viciously as of late. So this is something we need to constantly be on the guard, on the lookout for.
That's exactly right. And one thing that I love about Professor Merriweather, so he's a Christian, and he says that's why that he couldn't comport and he couldn't bend the knee to this gender bending ideology that we see going on. But what I love is that, at least as far as I've been able to tell, he hasn't lost his job, and that's also why he went to the courts, because he was afraid for his job and his security. But he still remains employed by the school, as far as I can tell, and now they can't force him to use certain pronouns. Do you think that that is perhaps one of the best victories, that he gets to remain on campus speaking the truth and they can't get rid of him, because usually these stories end with the employee having been fired by the school?
Yes, absolutely. This is a perfect, description of what the left typically does. They claim, oh, of course you have freedom of speech. Of course you have these rights, but there's a cost for them, and we're going to take away your job, your livelihood, your income. We're going to dox you. We're going to cancel you. We're going to make it so that you'll never be employed again in corporate America. So, yeah, you can say these things. You can have these convictions. You can have these principles, but we're going to make it very costly for you. So the fact that he was able to maintain his job, especially a job that enables him to, continue to educate and to enlighten young minds, is a massive victory, especially in the institution known as higher education, which is typically dominated by the radical left. So it's good to see that a Christian, a conservative, a traditionalist will continue to maintain his position in that institution, in that school. And this just goes to show that if we stand our ground, we push back, we will find victories, and we cannot give any ground to the left. Again, as you mentioned earlier, they want to take an inch. You give them an inch, then they'll take a mile. It's very incremental, and we need to push back every single step of the way. We cannot let bygones be bygones, because the side that just wants to be left alone is always the side that's going to lose.
And as this culture war continues to drag on, sometimes it seems almost that this preferred pronoun debate almost got lost somewhere in one of these other battles. Because, for example, you'll see even the supposedly Republican governor of Utah, he now introduces himself in some circumstances with his preferred pronouns. I guess he has to reassure everyone that he is, in fact, he, and he is a he. But we've seen this as well. It's something I harp on all the time. You see a lot of media outlets, even those that say that they are right-leaning or even outright conservative, and they'll use the preferred pronouns. If Caitlyn Jenner, who's really Bruce Jenner, will go out and do something, they'll say she instead of saying he, when he is in fact a he. Do you think that this story also shows that this is, as you were saying earlier, is a fight that we cannot give up even as this culture war rages on? Because if we give this inch, then it leads to sadly the mile of young kids having their sex trying to be changed and everything else that goes with that.
Absolutely. This is a fundamental fight. Ceding this would basically be ceding the basic concept of reality, that we have to deny what's in front of our very eyes, that we have to, what's next? We're going to claim that 2 + 2 is 5. I mean, this is basically the type of, path we're on if we concede the gender fight in this broader cultural war context. And as a New York Republican in a deep blue, deep liberal state, nothing frustrates me more than seeing these so-called conservatives in deep red states in a place like Utah have a Republican governor who professes to be a conservative in such a Republican conservative religious state as Utah using these pronouns. I cannot think of anything more pathetic. I mean, this is really the problem in our party, because deep blue state Democrats would never engage in anything close to a centrist or Republican or conservative position. But on the Republican side, we have Republicans in deep red conservative states that seem to act basically like Democrats. It's absolutely ridiculous. And this is a absolutely fundamental fight that we cannot be ceding any ground on. There is nothing conservative or principled about denying the concept of chromosomes and gender and biology. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. And any Republican going along with this should be ashamed of themselves, and they should be primaried with haste.
And because what does it look like to the public who may not follow along, every new headline that comes out every single day? What they would see is that the Republican side, which is supposed to be the bulwark against this, well, hey, look, even they're using the pronouns, even they're somewhat on board. And it continues to seed that ground. And then, of course, like I was saying, it really leaves our kids as sitting ducks. And that's what scares me the most. Because now you see the Biden White House and you see the ACLU and some of these other powerful forces in our nation. And they're saying that any states that impose bans on children, on minors, being able to obtain sex changes, surgeries, hormones, you name it, that they're going to come down with the weight of the law. At least that's what they're threatening at this point. Do you ever feel like that there's no off-ramp to this craziness?
They make it seem that way. They want it to seem like this is inevitable and that this is much more widespread than it is. That's why Twitter is such a useful weapon for them, because a very small radical fringe minority on Twitter that pushes this stuff appears to be a majority. But in reality, a lot of people are completely appalled by this critical gender theory, if you could even call it that. I mean, even many traditional Democrat voting blocs like Hispanics are very much turned off by this. So it just goes to show that a lot of these Republicans, places like Arkansas, where they were supporting a medical castration bill, or even Kristi Noem in South Dakota, who at first refused to sign a bill protecting women's sports. It just goes to show that they could be completely coerced and scared into going along with the left's narrative. And you also make a very good point when you say that this doesn't just stop at maybe superficial things like just stating your pronouns. This goes on into the physical realm, into actual mutilations of the bodies of young children who have been completely manipulated psychologically, or their situation mentally has been taken advantage of by these ideologues, and they have irreversible operations. They engage in hormone therapy, things that put them on a course for a very destructive lifestyle for the rest of their lives, and they have a very hard time recovering from that. So they are damaging the lives of many people permanently because they want to push this radical woke agenda against the concepts of science and and health and rationality. And this is why I have absolutely no patience for weak Republicans who are going to cave to this. I don't care if there's legal threats from woke nonprofits or the ACLU. I don't care if Amazon is threatening to take away a warehouse from your state. If you're not willing to stand on cultural and social issues, you're useless to us, because we're more than a GDP. We're more than just the economy. Culture matters, tradition matters, social issues matter, and this gender war certainly matters, both in a philosophical sense and in a very real physical sense in terms of the harm it's causing to both society at large and individuals.
Very well said, Gavin. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.